speaker this morning, we're very glad and very privileged to have Dr. Jay Quade. And I have to say that's Jay Quade, not Jake Wade. Jay Quade is a basketball player. Jake is in the University of Arizona Department of Geosciences, outstanding program nationally and internationally. Jay comes to us, and he's the acting, or the interim, or are you the full chair? He's the interim department chair. He comes to us with degrees from the University of New Mexico, University of Arizona, and the University of Utah, who we are playing this afternoon in basketball. In addition to 2 years of postdoctoral study in Canberra, Australia, he did that in addition to his previous training. His interest in training is in geochemistry, radiometric data, and his research focuses on paleoclimate and paleoenvironmental reconstruction, especially the recent geologic record. He has conducted his geochemical research on all continents except Antarctica, and includes recent geologic research in the Andes and Tibet, and on the paleoenvironmental context of early humans in East Africa, which is what he's going to be talking about this morning. So, in celebration of Darwin Day, I give you Dr. Jay Quade.
Everybody. This is a real pleasure to be here, and I wasn't familiar with all these organizations that were introduced this morning, but all I've got to say is, where do I sign up? So I'm not a big international speaker. In fact, I'm just a little University of Arizona professor, geologist. My claim to fame here today, and it's significant, is that I have probably covered more ground on foot geology of the rift in Ethiopia than just about any other person, aside from perhaps the Afars who are pictured here in this photograph in the background there. I'm sure they've covered more ground than me. Like that? Okay, sorry. Is that better? Excuse me. Bring this up, okay. I've covered more ground in Ethiopia than probably just about anybody out there. In fact, I did a little calculation. In 9 years of field work on foot, I walked over 2,000 miles. And that's conservative. And but the reason is, if you're going to find the fossils, and if you're going to date the fossils and put them in a paleoenvironmental context, and I do all those things, then you simply have to cover the ground on foot. Let's see, before I get started, however, I want to announce a prize. Hand this prize out. Well, I thought I was going to do it when my wife overruled it. I was going to hand out for the person who gives the most applause. I was going to give them the Evolving Darwin playset, which is really cool. You'd be happy to have it, but unfortunately nobody's going to get it because my wife really loves Darwin. She wants to keep this, but it says, "From fishman to genius in only 380 million years." And it's so cool that I'm sure it'll be on Antiques Roadshow 50 years from now, sold for $5,000 or something. But anyway, if you love Darwin, go out and get one yourself. Evolving Darwin playset. I think it's great. Please give me a standing ovation at the end anyway, if you're not going to. Okay, so the emergence of early humans in Ethiopia, and the backdrop there. Actually, when I first landed up in Ethiopia, I thought, gosh, I've come a long ways just to end up in Arizona, because it looks a lot like Benson, actually, I think. With the San Pedro River in the background, only it isn't. I think the first clue actually is the locals they look a little bit different in Africa and in Benson. And the other one is that it's so hot there that it's actually, field conditions are very difficult. We'll talk about this as we go along, but it's only 10 degrees off the equator, and it's like working every day in a Tucson afternoon for 8 years. So I had to get really used to being dehydrated. To start out, though, what I would like to tell you is just a quick story of a typical day in the life of a geologist out there. This involves a discovery of a really interesting fossil which has yet to be published, but I think will be soon hopefully will be published. It's an interesting fossil, particularly the circumstances of the discovery. And this little story, before I get going with the main body of the talk, is that it starts with actually three. It's a good thing that I used to practice using 22s and shotguns when I was a little kid, because I get used to the sound of the ballistics of different types of bullets, and it turned out that this was very important to this day, because the story starts out actually with 3 gunshots that went flying over my head. And I was with a student. I just separated from one of the AFRs with whom we were working, and I didn't know where he was, but these gunshots came overhead, and the student and I immediately hit the ground, thinking that we were being shot at by one of the other local hostile tribes in the area, or hostile groups, potentially hostile, the Somalis. This is very close to the Somali border. And so I thought I was being shot at, and I lay there on the ground listening, and then realized from the sort of report of the bullet that it was not an AK-47, but some sort of pistol, small caliber. And at that point I realized that I would probably survive the day, and that actually someone was not trying to kill me, but just signaling. And the AFR we were working with was carrying a pistol with him, and I reasoned that he was probably trying to signal us. Now, gunfire out in the AFR, in this part of Ethiopia, it either means somebody shooting at you or trying to signal you. In this case, it was signaling, and so I stood up and went toward the sound, told my student to stay behind. Off in the distance, I saw this guy walking toward me. It was the AFR that we were working with, and I'll show you a photograph of him here in a second. And he came up to me. He had been wearing a turban, and he set that turban on the ground. He had something in it, and I couldn't tell at first what he had, but that's exactly what he laid on the ground. If you take a closer look at this image here, particularly those 2 fossils toward the top, let's get a closer look at that. And I apologize if the image is a little fuzzed out. I stared at it and I realized that what I was looking at was the maxilla, this part right here, fossil human. So, unfortunately, I don't have a pointer. Let me just walk over to this to explain it. And I'll speak out. So, this is the maxilla. It's the front part right here. Is teeth along down that part. So, I thought, that's pretty crazy. I mean, human fossil remains are rare as hen's teeth out there. And then I hadn't really been looking at the Afar who brought this. His name was Asa Hamid, and when I looked up, he had a big smile on his face because he was holding the rest of the skull. He's kind of a joker, this guy. He was hiding this behind his back. And so you can see then that the maxilla that was in the scarf actually fit the lower part of the face right here. What an amazing specimen. I just about have heart attacks when I saw it. Oh, great. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, great. So this way I can move around. Because as a geologist, I'm used to moving, as I said before. So we estimate this fossil is about 400,000 years old, but we don't know for certain right now. We'll have to stay tuned for publication of this. But you can see that it's clearly human in form, but look at that interesting big brow ridge right there. It turns out it's female, probably in her 20s, and give you a couple different additional shots of the doggy's female. That's what it looks like, and it's rare actually for these fossils to come out so complete. Usually they're highly fragmentary, but this one is recognizably really human. And that's when we got back to camp that night. There I am on the right, my colleague Scott Simpson from Case Western Reserve University is on the left, and you can see his reaction. And we're fitting the skull pieces behind. But this isn't just a source of fascination for Western scientists. You can see all the Afars in the background, I'll be telling you more about, and equally exciting for them. And this happens maybe 2 or 3 times in a typical field season of a month, and it's always highlighted. We break out the beers afterwards, and there's lots of celebratory rifle fire. And the Gawley's cranium will join an ensemble of crania that have been found in the last couple decades to flesh out the last 600,000 years of human evolution.
Louder.
Sorry, is that better there? I really apologize, excuse me. Is that better? Okay. This will flesh out the last 500,000 years of human evolution with the discovery of the Gowie's cranium. Let's recall that the earliest fully modern humans, as represented by the Herto cranium, emerged 150 to 200,000 years ago. So our Gowie's cranium is a little older than that and fills the gap between Herto and some really nasty-looking sort of middle Pleistocene hominids, as represented by the Bodo cranium here. At least it scares me to look at that guy. In any event, stay tuned. Watch for the Gowie's cranium. It's a very exciting discovery. And so there's a typical day. One of the days that we spent out, this was in 2009 when this discovery was made. And fortunately, I have to say, usually gunfire in this area means somebody found a hominid. They're not shooting at you, although you never know. Okay, so our setting then is, how's my sound? Is it good? All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so our setting is Ethiopia, and here's the Awash River. And there's many famous early human fossil sites along the Awash River. Most famous is the Hadar area, where the fossil Lucy was found. Gona is the project area I come from, and then more recently where the Ardipithecus or Ardi remains were found. That's in the Middle Awash project area. So it's just a whole alignment of important paleoanthropologic fossil sites along the Awash River. And it's no coincidence that it's along the river, because that's the thing that attracted hominids to this very dry environment anyway. And so the larger physical setting then is over the Ethiopian Rift, and of course this is often termed the cradle of mankind, or the cradle of human evolution, the Ethiopian and East African Rift. Boy, that's a serious misconception. It's the cradle of where we've discovered fossils. The geologic record is very biased in terms of how things are preserved. I think fossils tend to be preserved in places where they're not being eroded, where the sediment's accumulating down in valleys. And in most of Africa, it's not accumulating a lot of sediment, hence the fossil record's not well preserved there. But when you rift, and this is the East African Rift and the Ethiopian Rift, when you rift open the continent, as in the case of East Africa, you accumulate sediments into those basins, and those are ideal sort of archives for early human fossils. So we don't really know where, we know human evolution, the epicenter of it is in Africa, but we don't know exactly where. What we do know is that the record's best preserved in East Africa. So be careful of that idea that this is the cradle of mankind. Africa certainly is, but Ethiopia is probably just a part of the picture. There's fossil discoveries occurring yearly out in this area. Not just when I was out there between 1999 and 2009, but as I said, they're frequent recent events. And the reason is because this region is very difficult to get to. It's one of the last parts of Africa that Westerners penetrated. In fact, the guy who actually got into this area for the first time his name was Wilfred Thesiger. He was a British explorer. Actually, he was the second one in. The first one was an Italian named Nesbitt, but it was all in the late 20s and early 30s. So this was the last part of Africa to open up. It's a difficult area to move around in, physically, as we'll see, and you also have to deal with the local groups, the Afars and the Somalis, because after all, it's their territory. And so it was only in the 1970s that the first geologists got into the area. And it is geologists over and over again. It's the guys out walking around. That's what we do for a job. Found these important early fossils. And it was in the 1970s that the fossil beds that eventually built up Lucy were discovered, 60s and 70s. And I believe it was in connection with oil exploration, though don't quote me on that one. But in any event, a lot of you probably heard of this famous fossil, Australopithecus, and Lucy's just a prime example. There's many examples out there of Australopithecus afarensis, and this is where she comes from, the Hadar Formation, which is right next to the Gona area, just up north. And let's see what else about it. I think the thing that's striking about Lucy, you'll notice, is that if we compare her stature here compared to a modern person, is that She stood about that tall, didn't she? And yet, in her overall form, 3 million years ago, she looks strikingly human in her features. What defines us as humans and separates us from the great apes? There's a range of features, but I think the ones I want to focus on today, two things that really distinguish us as humans, and Lucy's a good place to start to think about this, is that, so two features. One, she's a biped. Apes are quadrupeds, right? So she's standing on 2 feet. That's one feature. The other thing that, amongst a constellation of things, but another really key thing that distinguishes us from apes is our large brains. Cranial capacity 2 to 3 times that of the typical chimpanzee. What's interesting about Lucy, and the reason I want to start with her, is that she shows one of these distinguishing traits, but not the other. She's a biped, but she's also a small brain. And so by 3 million years ago, what we see in this Australopithecus afarensis is a hominid that has already developed bipedalism, one of the key features that distinguishes us from the great apes, but she hasn't developed large brains. And so that raises the natural question, when did bipedalism develop? And judging from the example of Lucy, it must have happened before Lucy, right? And when did large brains develop? And that must have happened after Lucy, because she has the brain case basically of a chimpanzee. So that must have happened in the last 3 million years. And so those are the two aspects of the record from the Gona area that I want to talk about today. I want to focus on when did bipedalism develop? Obviously before Lucy, and then when did the brains begin to emerge? And that's obviously post-Lucy. So we're going to go back in the record before 3 million in the first part of the talk, and then to look at brain emergence, to look at bipedalism, then forward the record younger than 3 million to look at brain emergence. Okay, let's do a few introductions here to the Gona Paleoanthropological Project Group. Began a 3-random project when I was there, led by Dr. Celeste Sama, an archaeologist, Scott Simpson, who's an anatomist, a human anatomist, over on the left, and then there I am, the chief geologist for the project on the right, joined by actually several students, but pictured here, Naomi Levin, a colleague over in the department, now retired, Bob Butler, who's doing some of the dating using paleomagnetic record out there, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then, most of all, I don't want to forget or neglect the many Afars who are part of the project. And the Afars, that's a local tribe, also known as the Danakil people, but all refer to them as Afars here, and they're the native inhabitants of the area, and they're the people you have to deal with in order to do the fossil collecting. And they actually find most of the fossils and bring them to us too. That's another thing to keep in mind. They're very sharp-eyed and very capable of moving across the landscape. It's their native habitat. And they end up, the ones that we hire and work directly for us, under our close control, they actually find most of the fossils, as pictured actually in this slide right here. Okay, and my favorite guy in the group is Asa Hamid and Ali Manda, amongst many in the group. Asa Hamid, very sharp-eyed, found many of the fossils that were discovered out there. Oh, I have to laugh at his glasses. He has perfect eyesight, but he just puts the glasses on because he thinks it's cool. Perfect eyesight. Okay, so as I said before, what I want to do today is I want to fill in, let's see if we have the cursor up here. See that? Yeah. I want to fill in this part of the record right here. Before Lucy, prior to 3 million years ago, and look at the question of the emergence of bipedalism. If Lucy is a biped, where does bipedalism develop in the record? And then I want to look at brain enlargement up in here. So that is the progression, although that's a very sort of anthropocentric or human orientation and perspective on the record. It all depends on your point of view, of course. And so if I was an orangutan up here, I would take quite a different view of this thing, but I'm going to take a human view, and so what we're going to look at is bipedalism and brain enlargement. Okay? Okay, first, the spectacular thing, besides all the great geology out there, are the amazing fossils that are and not just human fossils. And mind you, human fossils are rare things. When you're on a typical day out there, we'll find many more remains of things like elephants and hippos and fossil pigs than real humans. In fact, we used to joke about it that we'd have to find 200 hippo skeletons before we could find a human. And that just reminds a human fossil. And that just reminds, it's a reminder to everybody that I think if you set up a camera on an outcrop out there and then just ran it for 2 million years, sort of time lapse and saw everything go by, you'd see all this African wildlife going by, and then ever so occasionally, maybe once or twice a year, you'd see a hominid person walking by. They're small players and small fry on this landscape. It was dominated by other animals. And human dominance of the planet is only really a very recent development. And so we find lots of elephant remains, it's pictured right here. Probably a fossil snake up on the right here. Remains of a warthog. And then look at that, just a fantastically preserved fossil leg, not even crushed. Just too much. Preservation is wonderful out there, and that's why this is such an important archive for humans. Okay, so let's turn to the period before Lucy, that is in the 4 million year range, to a geological formation that is earlier than the Hadar Formation and contains these fossils, early human fossils that antedate Lucy. We spent a lot of time out there. We found over 50 partial remains of Ardipithecines in these deposits, and I'll show you an example of just one discovery in which, this is just to give you a sense for what these things look like on the ground. This is a location where we found a partial skeleton of an Ardipithecine that is Ardi. This is that iconic sort of fossil that antedates Lucy. And we actually found it in paludal mudstone. That's a fancy geological word for clay sediment that was deposited in a pond or in a kind of well. And it was in that pond, on the margin of it, that we actually discovered this partial skeleton of Ardipithecine. And one can easily envision that he came up to this pond edge, and for whatever reason he died. I don't think of old age, perhaps because of predation. We don't really know, but in any event, his remains are found in these pond deposits. As denoted right there, that's where the hominid remains were found, right below the frisbee there, for scale. And these are some of the fossils that were found at the site, held by Asa Hamadou and Alimanda. And what I find striking, I'm going to read this cartoon to you. Brethren and sisters, I've never noted the slightest resemblance between man and monkey, have you? And I love this cartoon because for me in working in these deposits, I'm always struck. I mean, I actually have a chance, we all of us do out there, a chance to pick these things out of the jungle. And what I'm always struck by is how similar they look. Maybe not in all the anatomical elements, but many of the things that we find out there, it gives you a really creepy feeling. Like there really is a connection, a really strong sense that physically these creatures, at least some of their anatomical elements, are not that different from us. For example, holding up a finger bone from an Ardipithecine against my own finger, I just think the dimensions are very similar. In other ways, however, Ardipithecines are quite different anatomically. One's really striking difference, and I'm sure my dentist is glad that I don't resemble Ardipithecines in this way. I showed him in the dentist's office with a rack of teeth like this, but this is the complete dentition of the Ardipithecus ramidus. And what you'll notice in this photograph is the huge canine, which is typical of Ardipithecines, and it's very chimp-like in its appearance. And also the sort of projecting snout on this thing. So this part right here, right? So here's the large canine, and then the projecting snout is prognathous, prognathing snout, which is typical of, as you know, of more typical of apes than modern humans. So right off the bat, you look at Ardipithecine when it's coming out of the ground, these Ardipithecines, and you realize that in terms of their skull anatomy, they look very chimp-like, small-brained, like Lucy. This is not surprising, because Lucy has a small brain case and more ape-like in its dimensions, as do Ardipithecines. So that anatomically is not so familiar when it comes out of the ground. some have small canine. There's going to be argument about this canine size. Some of the specimens we found, obviously the canines were large, but in the remains that were recently described from the Middle Awash, you've heard about the big announcement, the already remains that came out a couple of years ago. They talk about small canines in most Arctic-scenes, and I don't know how that controversy is going to eventually sort out. Here's a really interesting feature. Louder. Okay. I wonder if I can turn this up. Practically, I have to stick it in my mouth. I better not mess with this, but
That's better.
just like that, huh? Okay. All right, we'll see how this goes. Maybe I'll try this one. We'll try both here. Okay, so where are we? Long arms, yes. I'll show you a reconstruction of Ardipithecines here in a second, but very, very long arms. But no indications in the anatomy of the arms for habitual suspension. Now, this reconstruction is based on these Ardipithecines that came out a few years ago, and I won't comment on what we've seen at Gona, but I'll sort of give you the party line as it's understood about Ardipithecines now. So, the small brains, long arms, but no evidence of a habitual suspension, like, for example, a gibbon, in which you can see in the arm anatomy of a gibbon. What else? This is a big problem. A crushed pelvis. In fact, this specimen from the Middle Awash is so crushed we used to jokingly call it Squishopithecus, because once this hominid fell into the mud, he was apparently crushed either by just compaction, or more likely an elephant stepped on him, and it's just all broken up. And unfortunately, the pelvis, which would provide a lot of really important information about locomotion, is not well preserved in this specimen. However, parts that are well preserved, look at the elongated fingers on this Ardipithecine, but no evidence of knuckle walking. All right, because knuckle walking carries a very specific sort of morphology in the hands that's known from apes and chimpanzees today, and there's none of that morphology in this Ardipithecine. So he has long arms, but he's not hanging from trees. He has elongated fingers, but he's not knuckle walking. What's most interesting, I find, is the shape of the foot. Now look at this. And this gets back to this question of bipedalism. Is Artie a biped or not? Okay, first of all, look at the overall form of the foot. The big toe is like this compared to the foot. And what does that remind you of? It's very chimp and ape-like, isn't it? And that morphology is preserved in Ardipithecines. On the other hand, this is what's really interesting, is the bone density is very high in the foot bones, indicating bipedalism, indicating that, and it's very unchimp-like and ungorilla-like. The high bone density indicates that the Ardipithecines were focusing all their weight most of the time on those 2 feet, and not distributing it across 4 feet. So really, in the end, we have this amalgam of features in the Ardipithecines. Some features very ape-like and some very human-like. Let's review the ape-like features. The chimp-like skull, the opposed big toe in the foot, the longer arms. Stay tuned on the canines. But the human features, the high bone density in the feet indicating bipedalism. And so it's truly transitional. These Ardipithecines, more ape-like in their appearance than Lucy, but clearly they're headed down the road toward modern humans in this development of bipedalism. And so this question of when does bipedalism develop, the answer is it must have antedated Ardipithecus ramidus because he's already mostly a biped, but he's a weird biped, as we can see, right? Because of the shape of the foot. It's still very, very ape-like. So imagine a creature that stands about this high, just like Lucy. Sort of chimpanzee-like in height, Ardipithecines standing about this high, with a small skull. If you were to encounter this one sort of passing him on the street, you'd think this is a chimpanzee. But the striking thing is, he would be a biped and have very, very long arms. So, and not knuckle walk, and not hang from trees. Okay? There's the reconstruction for Archithecines. And notice the feet and the shape of the hands in particular. Fascinating, huh? It just blows me away. Okay, let's take a quick break. I want to talk a little bit about the logistics of finding fossils out there and camp life. So there's no hotels out in this country, let me put it that way. It's a pretty rough 2-day ride from the capital to get out in this area. You cross a sort of Serengeti-type landscape and finally arrive out in the middle of the study area. It stands at about 1,000 feet, 700 feet elevation, so it's, and as I said, it's 10 degrees north, so it's a very hot place. There is no such thing as a winter out there. We have to carry all our food for a month, and we mostly eat fresh vegetables, and you see they're laid up in the tent underneath the shade there on the left, and that's a month's worth of food for everybody. Sleep in tents, and we got around in Land Rovers, but occasionally also on camels for carrying gear, which is what the local Afars do. They're nomads. They're not agriculturalists. Let's see what else can be said about them. No electricity, although I'm told recently they've discovered cell phones in a big way. Well, that wasn't the case out there when I was there then, which I think is really, really great for them. Some of the dangers of field work out there. On the left is a pit viper. I think it's a gabbro pit viper, and those are pretty deadly. In fact, I think they're the source of most fatal snake bites in Africa, and there's a lot of them out there. And every time the Afars would see one, they would immediately kill it because they're afraid of it too, and they would kill it with rocks. Just stand around it and pummel it until somebody hit it in the head, and then they close in for the kill and cut its head off. Lots of scorpions on the right, which made me think twice because that's my foot. And I don't wear field boots, I wear sandals, and so you just really have to watch where you stop. 2,000 miles in sandals. The Afars, they're an experience in themselves. I really enjoyed working with these guys, but I was always unnerved by the fact that everybody above the age of 14 carried an AK-47, which is just the way it works out there. And let's see, the first thing you learn the first thing you do when you encounter an Afar, particularly one you don't know, is you look at the position of safety on their gun.
I'll speak up. So right here, that's safe, single shot, automatic. First thing you look at, because it's not a safety, it's trouble.
But they live in a difficult sort of environment, particularly in their relationship to the neighboring Somalis, and there's a lot of small-scale cattle rustling and fighting that goes on up there, which is sort of a backdrop to everything else we're doing. But perfectly nice to us, great bunch of guys. I have many friends amongst the Afars. And just a couple more shots of the way they look. If you ask me, pretty darn exotic. And the guy on the left there, he's a teenager, and that's the way I think of an Afar really wants to dress up and look gorgeous. It's the guy on the left. That is the sort of epitome of adolescent good looks in Afar eyes, particularly the long shady haircut. And then there's a girl on the right. The guy on the left, Ibrahim, actually, he was shot and killed by the Somalis a few years back. Okay, let's move to the last topic, which is brain enlargement. And we're going to have to look at the last 3 million years for that aspect of the record. And so let's just take another panoramic look at the stratigraphy and the deposits out in the Hadar area, the Gona area. Got to keep your stratigraphy right. I'm always amazed that the non-geologists are challenging geologists about their ability to do, differentiate up from down and do stratigraphy. But believe me, that's what we spend most of our time doing. We really pride ourselves, all of us, in the meticulous work we've done out there and trying to get the story right, the dating right, and telling up from down. So all I can say is, for the doubters, I wish they would just come up and have a look at how painstakingly we do this work. Let's put some stratigraphic boundaries and contacts through these deposits. In the lower part of the framings that had our formation, and let's recall that's where Lucy's from. She was found actually not in this location, she was found off in the distance, but about the stratigraphic level that's indicated there. Whereas, what's really interesting is that, and we'd love to find human fossils up higher in the record, but in the younger part of the record, over the last 3 million years, what we find lots of for the first time is the appearance of stone tools. And this goes back to this issue of brain enlargement I want to talk about. We don't actually have the fossils from much of this time period, particularly prior to 2.2 million years ago, but we have a lot of evidence that hominids' mental capacities are developing. And the reason we know that is because they're leaving behind these stone tools, which first appeared in the record about 2.7 million years ago. So as far as we know, Lucy, small-brained Lucy, is not a tool maker. If she was a tool maker, she wasn't a stone tool maker, she left nothing behind for us to see. But right after she disappears from the landscape and the next hominids appear, whoever they were making tools and leaving them behind. And there's a picture of an example of one there, that green piece of shirt, and you can see the flake scars that have been taken from it that represent the a crude but nevertheless distinctly human-like behavior in manufacturing and using tools. Okay, so tools from this time period are known as old one. They're actually just made out of cobbles. Take a cobble and then knock off a few flakes and you've got a tool. So they're fairly simple in their design, but they're unmistakable. And here's a picture of one of the Afros I worked with out there. Was also deceased. Died of yellow fever or something, malaria, we're not sure which. But he's holding a tool here in the foreground, and there's some more old one tools just rolling out the outcrop in the background. And these are the oldest stone tools in the world, everybody. They're about 2.6 million. And in fact, I'll show you here in a moment how we figured that out. A little younger in the record, 1.5 million years ago, we see the development, the appearance of what they refer to as the early Acheulean or Acheulean stone tool complex, and that's characterized by much more sophisticated stone tools, bifaces, we could call them. Biface because they're inflaked on both faces of the cobbles. And they're just referred to as hand axes. And I'm holding one in my hand there on the left in an excavation we're doing. And they just represents incremental improvement in the technology, but it's ever so slow. I mean, and a million years elapsed to basically get through the older one into the Acheulean. So things are developing slowly, but nevertheless, the sophistication tools is moving right along. So I want to think about stone tool making in the context of cognitive abilities because it's really a significant step. I realize that just a stone cobble that has a few flakes knocked off of it doesn't seem like a big achievement, but it really is a landmark. It really is a benchmark for the advancement of human cognitive ability. The dictionary defines a tool as any physical item that can be used to achieve a goal. Actually, we know that chimps use tools, elephants use tools, but what distinguishes human tool making is that it's humans that use tools to make tools, and they're much more complex than what other animals do. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do here, I might need some help, is I wanted to run a clip from a film, and actually you've all seen it, it's 2001, but I couldn't resist. I've never done this in a talk, and I may still fail today, but I just love this clip because it's Hollywood's version of man discovers tool making, and it's actually really cool. And when I first saw it, when this film came out, I was so inspired by it, but I just want to run it, if I can here, we'll give it a try. You guys have all seen this, but I really like this sequence because it's the only attempted depiction of man discovering tools that I know of for Hollywood. also provides an explanation. Unfortunately, no sound. Planes also sprock their Zarathustra at this point. Isn't this great? Yes, I did it, he says. So you guys remember the story. The way it works is that particularly the significance in the film of the Black Obelisk, I think the idea is that humans got the idea for stone tool making by being exposed to this disc that was left by extraterrestrials. It's a good story. The Black Obelisk was deposited there in order to inspire intellect. They discovered tools at that point, you can see Muhammad, and then there's a great scene in the film, which I won't run that clip, in which they take the bone and he throws it up into the air and it turns into a Pan Am interstellar transporter. And I think that's great. That just sums it up. What I like about it is it stresses the idea that these stone tools and going to the moon are one and the same thing. It's just sophistication. And that the appearance of these stone tools in the record at Gona 2.6 million years ago is a huge intellectual breakthrough. Cognitively, it sort of completes the picture in terms of our humanness. And from there on out, it's just increasing, it's just amplification on that thing. But that our humanness, our distinct humanness, has emerged at that point. And so this is a really important event, isn't it? And I realized, in terms of trying to date as early as tool making, understood that from the get-go and put a tremendous amount of effort into trying to establish the antiquity of the oldest stone tool sites out there. So here comes 4 or 5 slides of a sort of technical nature that will tell you about how we actually date things, and then we'll wrap up the talk. The place, this has been published, where the oldest stone tools were actually found by an archaeologist and I one afternoon. I was parked out in some outcrops off in the distance and looked across into this valley and saw that white layer that stretches across the top of the slide. And that's what caught my eye. Because I knew that those white layers, as opposed to the brown layers, the white layers are actual volcanic glass. They're ash from volcanic eruptions. And as I'll show you here in a second, they are the things that we often use for dating of the rocks out here for radiometric dating. And so I went straight for that and walked across the valley to look at this white layer. And as we're walking up this hill, the one we see in the foreground, the archaeologist I was with, it was Mike Rogers, looked down at the ground and he said, "My God, there's old choppers and tools that are coming out of the outcrop from below this white unit, which we'll call a volcanic tuff." And I knew that this area was geologically old, but I didn't know exactly how old, and that's what we'll establish here in a second. But first of all, I want to show you, there's the excavation of OGS-7 on the hillside. That's the canvas we put up in order to protect the excavation. And so let's go onto the canvas to show you what we found, and I would like to say, actually that we found the Black Obelisk. But unfortunately, we didn't, because that would have been pretty cool. So I can't give you an explanation for why stone tools start out when they do, but so in seriousness, what we actually did find on the campus then were the oldest stone artifacts, as we'll show you here in a second, and they came out 2.58 million years. That's what they look like in the exposure, and I realize it's not all that impressive, but things look that way in the excavation. But in any event, we found about 1,000 artifacts in about a square meter area that these early humans left behind. And as I said, about 2.6 million years ago. So how do we know that that's the age of these artifacts? How do we come up with that 2.58? Because that's the published date that when you watch a National Geographic special or Discovery special, you'll hear this date thrown around, and this is how we did it. It was just a couple of us working on this. So here's the setting again, and there's OGS 7 and the excavation canvas, and we started by dating the tuff itself, because that would provide, let's see, the tuff is on top of the site, so it would provide a minimum age for the OGS 7, the archaeological site, wouldn't it? And when you sample those tuffs and bring them back to the University of Arizona and look at them under a microscope, what you see is a mixture of volcanic glass. So these long ropey things here, that's the volcanic glass. That's a piece of black mica, and then there's other mineral phases in there. And the really key thing about this is that some of these mineral phases contain the, so let's back up. Some of these mineral phases contain sanidine. Now, sanidine, there's the chemical formula written there up on the left. Now, don't be intimidated, everybody. I realize it's a string of letters, but you guys all remember your high school chemistry, right? And what does K stand for? Thank you. All right. And I'm not surprised you know. That's good. So potassium. And we're going to use potassium to date the sanidine. But not all potassium. We have to use a radioactive mineral, or a radioactive isotope of potassium, in this case potassium-40. And we take advantage of the fact that potassium-40 decays to argon-40, and does so on a very predictable sort of half-life of just over 1 billion years. And we can then date them when we back up. If we can assume, so here's, how does radiometric dating work? We have a radioactive isotope that decays from an unstable parent, whether it's potassium or uranium or carbon-14, take your pick, and it decays to a stable daughter, which in this case is argon-40. And it does so at a well-established half-life. As long as we know the half-life, and we can assume, this is a big assumption, that the system remained closed. In other words, as potassium-40 decayed to argon-40, there was no loss or gain of those isotopes except by radioactive decay. In other words, closed system, no, you can't, it's a closed cage, nobody's allowed to get out. And the only transformation that occurs is transformation of potassium to argon on this half-life. If we can make that assumption, and sanidine, it turns out it's a very good mineral for that. It's almost the perfect sort of geochemical cage. Typically, well-preserved sanidine holds in the parent-daughter. If we can do that, then we can establish the age just by knowing the number of atoms. We can measure those today. So here's time 0 here, time increasing in that direction, and here's the number of atoms. And at time 0, the blue line here is argon, which is the daughter, and we don't have any argon because at time 0 there is no argon present, but gradually the argon builds up as the potassium-40 decays. So hence the mirror image of these two. That's what happens to the parent, that happens to the daughter. But the key point is that the age, which we read off this part of the graph, is a unique function of the number of atoms, as long as we satisfy that closed system assumption. And so let's see, that's 2 billion years. 2 million years would be right in here, so a GONA sample would have very little radiometric argon in it, but it would fall right in there. But we could measure the number of atoms and then extract the age. So that's basically how it's done. It's not done here routinely in Arizona, but these samples were actually dated at a laboratory in Mexico Tech, in Socorro, which is a center for this. And so we do the age calculation then. Again, let's not be intimidated by simple little equations here. Just remember that the buildup of daughter argon-40 is proportional to how much of the parent we have present to begin with, or at some time elapsed. This is a constant that contains the half-life, and this is the exponential part. That's just mathematically an exponential curve right there. So argon will increase in proportion to time and in proportion to how much potassium is present. And if we can measure the amount of argon and potassium in the sample, and we know the half-life, we can solve for time. So that's how that works. And that's what we do. And that's why we came up with an age of 2.53 plus or minus 0.15 million years on that sample. But that's a minimum age, isn't it? We know that our oldest stone tools in the world, as it's going to turn out, are at least that old. But how much older? And so let's turn to one other method before I close the talk. And that involves paleomagnetic dating. And I showed you an example of Bob Butler toward the beginning of the talk, employing, actually sampling sediments for paleomagnetism. Well, what's the idea here? It's actually pretty simple. Anybody that's run a magnet through sand in their backyard when they were a kid, and you collect all the magnetite onto your magnet, right? All natural sediment is full of naturally magnetic minerals like magnetite. And when that material, when those magnetic minerals are deposited by a stream, for example, like a river, if the grains are small enough, if the magnetites are small enough, they'll actually orient with respect to the existing magnetic field. So let's say we have a rainstorm coming up next Wednesday, right? That's going to make the Santa Cruz run. Water's going to flow down the Santa Cruz from our rainstorm. And if we go up after the storm and measure with a magnetometer the direction of the magnetite in that sediment that was deposited by that storm coming up on Wednesday, it would all be pointing toward the North Pole. All be oriented that way. And this is also true, it's true of sediment, it's also true of magma when it erupts up out of the earth and congeals into solid rock, particularly deep ocean basalts. They're full of magnetic minerals, and they can serve as a sort of chart recorder for the history of changes in the orientation of the magnetic field through time. Probably most of you realize, particularly if you watch the movie Core, Hollywood's got a depiction of all this stuff, that the Earth's magnetic field shifts from time to time, right? This is well known. And it happens roughly every million years. And it goes, in other words, what it does is it literally, the polarity of the magnetic field shifts from north to south. So in the last 700 million years, all magnetic grains are pointing toward the North Pole, but all magnetic grains prior to that time, back to about 2.6 million years ago, they pointed the other direction, pointing toward the South Pole. And nobody knows why. If you figured out why the Earth's magnetic field shifted like that, you'd probably get a Nobel Prize, but we take advantage of the empirical observation that the Earth's magnetic field does shift, and it does in a very regular sort of pattern. It's been well dated. And it turns out that there is a magnetic shift that occurred 2.58 million years ago. It's recorded in deep ocean sediments that I thought maybe we could detect in looking at that sedimentary profile from OGS-7. So let's go back and take advantage of the fact that we get these flip-flops in the Earth's magnetic field and see if we can detect one of those flip-flops in the sediment down below the site. And the one we're looking for is the one we know occurred 2.58 million years ago, just from other records, not from GONA. So how do you do this? You have to extract plugs of sediment right here. You actually drill them out with a garden variety Ace hardware drill. You have to orient the plug before you take it out, and orient it with respect to the modern magnetic field. You want to know how it's oriented, how it's oriented with respect to true north today. And then you make a record of that and carefully seal away the plugs right here that you then transport back to the United States or elsewhere for analysis. And these are little archives, these little plugs record the magnetic orientation of the sediment and of the magnetite when those deposits were laid down. Okay, so let's go back to the site. And so, for example, that site right there, that's the first one I sampled going up through profile, and red is meant to denote reversed. So from that sample, we got an orientation that showed that when those sediments were laid down, the Earth's magnetic field was reversed with respect to that. Okay? We walked up the hill in the blazing African heat and sampled more sites, got right up to the level of the site, and it was all the magnetic grains were reversed up to the level of the site, and then above the site, it's normally magnetized. That's blue right here. And so we realized that in crossing, we thought, once we got this analysis back, that we were right on one of these magnetic flip-flops, right? But to check that, we wanted to be sure that everything was normal above that, because that's what you'd expect for an extended magnetic reversal. And sure enough, everything above that was normally patterned. So we have a reversal down here and level up here. And that's exactly what you'd expect for this transition between the Gauss chron, which is reversed, and the Matayama chron, which is normal, and we know that event to be 2.58 million years. So the dating of these remains, then, it's a combination of this world's oldest archaeological site, it's a combination of a minimum age based on radiometric dating, but then really nailing it down, and just by pure coincidence, finding that the archaeological site itself was within 10 centimeters of this magnetic shift, which is very interesting. I suppose people with more imagination could make more out of that, but for me, it's it's a nice example of the power of using two different techniques to really nail down the age. So this is it. This is the oldest stone tools in the world. This is the, as I said, this is the dating a very, very significant sort of intellectual development or breakthrough for early humans. Okay, let me just sum up there. When you wake up tomorrow, I want you to replay through your head, before you have coffee, what Dr. Quade was trying to say in his talk today. There's two simple things I want you to take away. One, think of Lucy as 3 million years old. Lucy's a biped, so wind is bipedals in development. It must be older than Lucy. If you look at Ardipithecus ramidus, date 4.5 million years ago, actually doesn't answer the question because Ardipithecus is a biped, but the body is a strange mix of features. As I pointed out before, the skull is very tube-like. So bipedalism, in inverted commas, a form of bipedalism is in place by 4.5 million years ago. After Lucy, after 3 million years ago, this big cognitive leap represented by stone tool making, it dates to 2.58 million years. It's based on these two dating techniques that I just talked about. And then last of all, the Gowie's cranium dates to 200,000 years ago. I talked about this in the beginning. Where does the Gowie's cranium fit? I guess we'll find out as soon as this is published in the paper. And that's all I really had to say, except again to wish everybody happy Earth Day.
We have time for a few questions. We'll take your mic back, that one. Take it out to the audience. You give it back to your mic.
Thank you. I've heard it seriously proposed that no human or that no animals except humans are conscious, and humans didn't become conscious until about 40,000 years ago. I have my own opinion of that, but what do you think?
40,000 years ago? This is a question for me. Depends on how you define consciousness, I suppose. 40,000 years ago, I think what people were referring to there is the emergence of fully modern humans in Europe about 40,000 years ago. But no, again, it goes back to, I think, how you define consciousness. Let me put it back to you. How would you define that? Maybe we'll work with that.
Well, I consider all forms of life, at least animal life, to be aware. And I believe that consciousness is something that has evolved. I think, that they're conscious much as we are, but they have limitations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, chimpanzees are as conscious as Homo sapiens, but they don't have a lot of the awareness or understanding that we do. And, you can take reptiles. They're conscious, they seem to be. So it's a matter of degree.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's certainly consciousness, human consciousness, emerged by gradations. And I think the reason people talk about the 40,000-year-old date is because that's some of the oldest human burials, though not the very oldest. So an awareness, consciousness of death, maybe is what that refers to. Honestly, I don't know. Here we can see that these early humans, 2.6 million years ago, were intelligent enough to make tools. They were capable of complex premeditation. So certainly some level of intellectual ability. Did they have the capacity for language? Were they aware of death? Any of those things? I'm not sure about that. And we'll never know, will we? Am I loud enough? I'm really sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, another question. It's a very interesting talk, but I wonder if you could comment on or speculate on how muscular these animals were, and just on the kind of environment they might have lived in terms of other animals
Sure.
and fauna.
Yeah, good question. Okay, first of all, to musculature. That's more of a question for my colleague Scott Simpson, who's a human anatomist. Let me tell you this one thing, though, is that some of these stone tools that we picked up, those hominids had a hell of an arm on them. Let me put it that way. I don't think I could do, particularly these Acheulean things that are 1.5 million years, tremendous upper body strength to do something like that. I have no question in my mind, and this has been said about chimps, that they're much stronger than humans, aren't they? And that's probably the case all the way back through the record, but I can only comment on, I know by 1.5 million years ago, I would not want to get in a wrestling match with these guys. I'm absolutely certain about that. Very, very strong. Your second question, I can really speak to that one. We've worked very hard on establishing the paleo-environmental context of these early humans. And what's so is actually the present is a key to the past. It's kind of unexciting. I think all of these hominids lived in a kind of Serengeti type environment, or a mix of woodland and grassland, although grassland, it got more Serengeti-like in appearance the younger you got in the record, particularly after 2.7 million years. But I think if we were to go back in a time machine, it wouldn't look hugely different from today, frankly.
You spoke of magnetism having changed to 2.6 million years ago.
Right.
I don't know whether that was gradual or quick or what, but my question is, what do climatologists, how do they relate to that? Has there been any significant understanding about how magnetism shifts affects climate
Yeah.
change?
Well, that's a great question.
And whether there's any consideration of magnetism in the present predictions about future climate change.
That's a good question. First of all, I can answer or attempt. There's some knowledge of how fast these things occur, and they're not all that fast. In other words, the shift in polarity, it's thought to occur not on the scale of a human lifetime, but probably on the scale of thousands of years. In places where you have very rapid sedimentation rates, you can actually see the magnetic field when you do the measurements, the reconstruct the magnetic field, you can see it flip over up through a section where the sediments are laid down very fast. And it's thought to, take thousands to tens of thousands of years for the flip to occur. What they also detect during that period is a marked weakening in the magnetic field, which is very interesting because our magnetic field shields us from all kinds of potentially pernicious, health-threatening cosmic rays. And it actually blocks and shields us from that. So those would be periods where there'd be heightened influx of cosmic rays. And you'd think that that would be damaging to life and wildlife, but people have looked at this, thought about this a lot, and haven't detected any effects, which is very interesting. In other words, no major extinctions occur during these boundaries, during these magnetic events. No evidence of big die-offs, which I find quite curious. In terms of climate change, again, I don't think nothing's been detected. And yet, it hangs in the back of my mind that these effects must be out there, and we just haven't worked it carefully. That's a really hot and interesting research topic.
You started somewhere there, is it okay? With the small brain of Lucy.
Yes.
And it continued later on with small brain, and suddenly, I don't know when, I would assume that the growth of the brain was gradual.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so are there findings there to show the gradual growth of the brain? Where are they? And when did the brain, the human brain, the hominin brain, got to be our size?
Yes, okay, good question. So let me start with your last question, and then we'll move backward. Fully modern humans, in terms of a cranial capacity, identical to today, that emerges in Africa between 150 and 200,000 years ago. So after the Gawi's cranium, the thing I started out with, and it apparently happened in Africa, and then people radiated out from there to settle various parts of the old world, arriving in Europe, it's generally thought, around 50,000 years ago. Okay, so that's the end game. That's those fully modern humans. But you're absolutely right. The enlargement of brain size was incremental. And incremental between the time of Lucy, who has a small brain, and this 200,000-year-old fully modern human. And that, for example, the Gawi's cranium is one step in that evolution, because her brain size is intermediate. The folks that made those 1.5 million-year-old hand axes, that's referred to as Homo erectus, and he and she, they have intermediate sort of brain size, a step in the evolution. The problem is that when you look at the period right after Lucy, say 2.7 to about 2 million years ago, the fossil remains are very, very thin. And that's why I resorted to the stone tool evidence. I think what it's telling us is brain size, things are getting more sophisticated, and brain size is enlarging at that point, as evidenced by the presence of the tools, but we actually don't have the hominids. I mean, this is a really hot thing. If they could find a hominid that goes with those stone tools, that would be big, big news, but it just hasn't been found yet. So that's a good question, and I think the answer is yes, it's incremental, and the fully modern humans developed about 200,000 years ago.
It's tempting to think that when the magnetic field goes through zero and stays there in a gradual fashion, that there'd be an acceleration in the mutation rate of animals and humans, so that you might be able to keep up with the damage that's being inflicted. It's just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been recognized, and that appeals to my intuition too. You'd think something major, this would have big biological impacts, and yet, as I said, they just haven't seen it in the record. We just haven't looked hard enough.
Hello, that was a very interesting talk, thank you.
Thank you.
I've talked to U of A students who are young Earth creationists. Have they shown up in your classes, and how do you handle them?
Boy, if they haven't spoken up. It does come across in evaluation sometimes, though, so they come through the back door. Comments like Dr. Quade should be more even-handed, but I can't be even-handed about this. I'm sorry, I'm so shaped by my experiences there. I've had the privilege of working on one of the most complete and amazing human archives out there. I've walked it, I've seen it. Yeah.
Jay, why is it that the Earth has a magnetic field in the first place? What's going on that makes that magnetic?
You got it. Somebody said it. It's the iron in the core, and the liquid core, that's right. Yeah, it's a giant magnet. The thing is, it's a giant, iron magnet in the center. And a liquid outer core, hence the solid inner core, is thought it can spin and move. And that may have something to do with this flip-flop.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question that Dr. Paul Martin would probably ask if he was still alive, and that is, have you seen any indication as they progressed in tool usage that there was that they extinguished any species as a result of their progress with tools?
Thank you for that question. I love that question, and Paul was a good friend of mine. The way Paul would answer it, no, the way I can answer it, because Paul and he asked this question, and we debated this a lot. I think there's clear evidence for that. As you go up through the non-human fossil record in Ethiopia, what you notice is that, I haven't quantified this, so this is sort of shooting from the hip, but I really think it to be true, that there is permissive evidence for humans actually killing off certain species. This is a hard thing to prove, but for example, let me give you one example. In the 4.5 million year old geologic levels out there, where there's Ardipithecines, one of the coolest fossils I ever found was a giant land tortoise. It's so big, it's like a third of the size of a Volkswagen. I found the entire thing just intact sitting on the ground. And I looked at that and I thought, this thing would be a sitting duck for hunters. And it's interesting that things like that, sort of what I call sitting duck species, tend to drop out as you come up through the record. They don't last, these things, these giant land tortoises. They just disappear in the late Pliocene period. I can't prove that it's overkill, the way Paul would describe it, but in fact, I really believe Paul's correct in his view that the recent extinctions are human-induced and that there's probably other occurrences of them, but it's just going to be very hard to prove.
What's the earliest evidence that humans began to be storytellers, be able to make sentences or speak of imaginative gods and things?
That's even harder than the consciousness one. Human conscious one. Well, again, it goes back to when does the capacity, for example, for speech develop? And I think that's thought to occur maybe in primitive form amongst the Neanderthals. But I don't know what the current thinking is on that. It's just looking at the form of the skull and some of the pattern in the interior. But I'm not an expert on that, and so I better leave off on that. And how can we really know for sure? That's the other problem. I mean, these are the kind of things that just don't preserve in the geologic record.
From the injuries, do we see any evidence that tools were used for security or for aggressiveness against others like themselves as opposed to animals?
Yeah, interesting. There is evidence of how these tools were used. Actually, their cut marks begin to appear on bones at about this time, 2.6 million years ago, from the middle Awash area, and almost sure signs of butchery, likely using stone tools. As for the rest of it, I don't really, were these stone tools used on each other? I don't know. There's certainly evidence of modification of some of these human fossils. Remember the one I showed you of the Bodo cranium toward the beginning, that big sort of ugly guy from about 500,000 years ago? As I recall with that fossil, there's evidence that his brains had been extracted. The foramen magnum had been expanded, and that's a typical practice sometimes with cannibalism. So the thinking is maybe he was a victim of that. So I don't know whether they use stone tools for that, but mostly just no evidence at all. We don't know for it. Yeah.
My meager knowledge of biology, from that I remember that the definition of a species is that even with a lot of variation within a species, like a wolf and a chihuahua, that they can, have, I don't know how you would test this with a wolf and a chihuahua, but they could create a fertile offspring. At what point, if you know, at what point does the evolutionary change produce a new species,
Speciation.
as opposed to some variation that we're, like I've heard that we could find Neanderthal genes in some people. And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. One thing I didn't mention is how varied, particularly in this time period between 1 and 2 million years ago, how varied the types of hominids there were out there. It's been speculated that there were at least three different species present in parts of East Africa during that time period. And they are distinct in terms of their fossil remains, and hence I assume that means they're genetically distinct too. They weren't interbreeding populations. And that's certainly around by 2 million years ago. I suspect as we get further into the record, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg, it's my feeling, in terms of really our understanding of the fossil record at many of these different levels, is that there's going to be much more variation and many different versions of humans on the landscape at one time, not just between 1 and 2 million years ago, and that because they are distinct, they are interbreeding populations. But it's too soon to say on that one. For most time periods, our knowledge of the record is not mature enough to say. But it's an interesting point, and I would just stress too that we're the experiment that made it. It looks like there were at least, particularly in the period 1 to 2 million years ago, there were 3 experiments going, 3 different human-like forms, non-interbreeding, that were slightly different adaptations, and 2 or more were taken out, and the ones that survived are us. Taken out in inverted commas. We don't know how that happened. Maybe that goes back to Ford's point. Between 1 and 2 million years ago, let's see, there were, I don't have the slides along, there was the fossil that used to be referred to as Zingianthropus. It's Australopithecus robustus, or boisei, and they're characterized by huge heads, big chewing muscles, big sagittal crest for lots of chewing, big flat molars for eating apparently grass or hard material, and they're quite distinctive looking. And at the same time, there's a species present in the landscape that's thought to be our ancestor. That's the one that made the hand axes that I showed you, the Acheulean hand axes, 1.5 million years ago. That's Homo erectus. And then there's thought to be another form out there referred to as Australopithecus africanus. So it's Australopithecus boisei, africanus, and erectus. It's a minimum of 3. Depending on who you talk to, there may be more out there. All at the same time in East Africa. We're used to a sort of monogenetic world in which we're all the same species, but that's not the way it's always been. In fact, I think that's more the exception than the rule when you look back at the entire record. It's a weird thing to think, to have other forms of life coexisting around you look very similar to you in form, but they're not your species.
Yeah, Steve mentioned the young Earth creationists. There's not a year goes by, basically, we don't hear, or I don't hear, somebody declare that the Grand Canyon proves a lot of this. Is there any...
Sorry, the Grand Canyon what?
Proves a lot of their ideas about, young Earth creationism. So my question is there any reasonable answer to give the people that propound that?
I have to admit, I'm in a different orbit, scientifically. I've heard some discussion about that, but honestly, I've not looked at why they think that's the case. It's so far out there, and the truth is much more interesting about why the Grand Canyon developed. And it's hotly debated, but creationism doesn't get on my radar screen.
Hi, I don't believe you mentioned fire, and I just was
Oh.
wondering whether was a cause of man evolving.
Oh, absolutely, that's a good point. And that would be another one of those sort of smoking guns, no pun intended, smoking campfires, for, you know, this cognitive emergence, this increase in cognitive ability with time with man. That comes along much later. So our big landmarks, let's see, if stone tool making starts at least 2.6 million years ago, fire comes much later. It's a hard thing to prove because ash doesn't preserve very well. Geologically, it's very unstable. Ash just it alters and disappears, but it's pretty clear that it's been around for several 100,000 years. So relatively recently. Quite possibly much further back in the record, it's hard to imagine. So early humans, Homo erectus is in Europe, southern Europe, and parts of Asia, probably as far back as 1 million years ago, and it's hard to believe he didn't do it without clothes and fire. I can't imagine living in southern France or in Britain without fire, quite frankly. So I'll just throw that one out there, but nobody's proved it. Definitely, in the last couple 100,000 years, there's clear evidence in the record. And it's pre-modern, fully modern man, too. Neanderthals are doing it, for example.
You said that there were 3 different forms of humans that were in competition and only one survived.
Yeah, at least 3.
At least 3.
Yeah.
What is basically understood as the reason the other 2 didn't survive? What was it about them?
Well, there's one possibility, isn't there? Yeah, that they killed each other, or nobody knows. You know, that's the problem. But of course, the possibilities is that they killed each other off. This has been mentioned as a possibility with Neanderthals, for example, a more recent example in the last 100,000 years. The other possibility is they interbred, and maybe some of these species they weren't genetically so far apart that wasn't possible. Although it's hard to imagine when you look at the Australopithecus boisei, he's so different looking from us that I think he's given not only a different species but a different genus from us. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine eliminating his. It's not as if like Homo erectus came in and wiped out the foodstuffs and the habitat for boisei, because he's a grass eater, and that's that's available all through the record. So that explanation is kind of hard to swallow. I don't know.
The substance of my question was whether there was something in the makeup of these other forms of humans that made them less adapted in the environments.
Yeah, that's another possibility. Maybe in the face of climate change too, that they just couldn't adapt to the changes. Although there again, I don't see huge environmental changes in East Africa across these time periods. It's very gradual and it's subtle, and I think the present is very much a key to the past. So I don't think they were experiencing big environmental shifts and changes, certainly not rapid ones. People have speculated, though, that some possibly catastrophic explanations, for example, the eruption of Toba 70,000 years ago, that's a volcano in Indonesia, but it was so enormous that it left a blanket of ash all over the Indian Ocean and in East Africa. And there's evidence that impacted climate for a time and may have created some selective pressure. So I wouldn't throw that idea completely out the window, but I'll tell you, nobody's proven it, that climate change has necessarily had evolutionary impacts. Certainly speculated upon, but yet to be demonstrated.
Interesting you mentioned Indonesia. Interesting you mentioned Indonesia. My question was, how would you fit Java Man into this, just as a comparison?
Sure. Java Man is, that's just the sort of lay term for Homo erectus, particularly I think a late Homo erectus. And so it would be akin to that tool maker that made the Acheulean hand axes that you saw on the screen there 1.5 million years ago, but it would be his descendants that had spread out of Africa across the old world. Because the old world outside of Africa was invaded several times, at least twice that we know of. probably many times by hominids. And Homo erectus is apparently the earliest group to do it, and then fully modern humans more recently. So the Java man would fit into that earlier migration. And the dating on Java man is, the Indonesian Homo erectus is controversial, but thought to be in the order of 1 million years plus. So that's where he fits. Be one of these tool makers, actually.
Recently, they've come across a mutation in the sweat glands that increased the number of sweat glands in humans. Would this have an impact, do you think, in terms of climate adaptation?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Sweat glands are not preserved in the geologic record, unfortunately, but there are some interesting developments that occur when you look at Homo erectus. The best example of Homo erectus is this Narikotomo boy. And it's dated, I believe, about, don't quote me on this, but I think it's around 1.6 million, so it's an early Homo erectus, but very long-limbed, rather like modern Africans, and really fits the bill for what we associate with a classic adaptation with warm climates and a sort of high surface to volume ratio that allows you to lose lots of heat efficiently, as opposed to people in more northerly latitudes where the premium is on retaining heat. And that sort of body form, that endomorphic long body form, appears early with Homo erectus. So many people think that's what that represents, and that may go along with the sweat gland idea, although that part's not going to be preserved. But form does gradually follow environment in Africa. There is some support for that concept.
How long back did the DNA go? We've read a lot recently about the linkage, and are you able to get DNA to what year? Thank you.
Can't say I'm really up to date on this. I think they've gotten back certainly 100,000, maybe several 100,000 years, depending on the circumstances. But DNA just doesn't, you have to be extraordinarily lucky, special circumstances for it to be preserved. So majorly, perhaps that record will be pushed back further in the record, but right now it only goes it's pretty shallow. It's only the last 100,000 years plus, maybe. I don't think the prognosis is very good for where I've worked because it's just too hot, and there's too much oxidation, and it's just corrosive to DNA. So I'd be surprised if they'll ever get anything out of the stuff we worked on. DNA won't make it.
I want to go back to the growth of the brain, which for me is this is what makes us humans and whatever we are. If it happened in the past, and well, according to you, for the last 200,000 of years, we are stuck on the same size.
Yeah.
Is there anything to block us from growing farther, which is the stuff of science fictions, you know, and fantasy movies and things like this, the things that I don't watch, but it's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
It's exciting. Maybe we're just the beginning of the way.
Well, that's a very thought-provoking question. It comes down to does natural selection still, that's how things change, right? They just don't change. It's by natural selection.
What can we do?
And we've arrested a lot of the natural selection process. For example, selection for good eyesight. We took care of that one, didn't we? That's no longer a pressure. And other sort of selective pressures have gone out the window. Some would argue that why bother with biological evolution when sociological evolution is moving through so quickly? In the same human form, we've gone from hunter-gatherers, a very simple form of life, to landing on the moon. And it's all with the same brain case.
Right.
Same brain size.
But we can grow a little, even
So that's what I'm saying is that we have the growth there. Just within the current design, there's lots more possibilities.
even among us, there are differences, you know.
Yeah.
So, how can we take the maximum that we have now? And some people have more developed brains than others.
Yeah.
And somehow take it from there and
I think this is a touchy topic, isn't it? This is eugenics.
Yeah.
manipulation of human genes. Yeah, I should ask the theorists. They said that. We know, and theoretically, I think it's absolutely possible. Everything else has been amenable to manipulation and alteration. Unicorn, pigs, why not humans as well? The question is ethically, do we want to go there? Probably not, right? I think we should settle for sociological evolution.
You said that there's no evidence that climate change had, so far, has had any real impact on evolutionary development. At the risk of
Can I revise that a little bit? I would say it's hotly debated, and I would say in the longer term, yeah, there is evidence for it. Very coarse grain changes, but things like toba eruptions and like that, I think that's what I was referring to. These abrupt short-term changes. It's highly debatable in my view.
My question is whether, at the risk of going a little far afield and also striking maybe a more pessimistic note than Mika did, does this evidence and research impact the current, concern about global warming, global climate change, and the irony that, our own contribution to global climate change may, in fact, threaten our survival as a species?
I think it'd be politically correct to agree, but I don't actually think so. What humans have been able to do, fully modern humans, in terms of adapting to the most extraordinary range of conditions and environments, from equatorial Africa to the polar regions, bespeaks our ability to adapt to a wide range of ecologic circumstances, and things that, and changes that we'll be confronted with down the road. I'm not saying that civilizations, it won't have an impact, and that civilizations won't fall, and things like that. In terms of actual threat to the species, we're extraordinarily adaptive. So that's my view of it. We'll cope.
Okay, this is probably a bad question mark before lunch, but the hominoid that appeared to be largely a grass eater, I wondered if your colleagues thought that maybe it adjusted the cellulose in grass like ruminants or like rabbits, that they grow bacteria in their cecum and then they eat the bacteria after it comes out of them in their feces. I wondered if, and just by the Geographic and the other fossils, these hominoids that supposedly ate mostly grass live in a place where other vegetation was sparse or animal life?
No, other resources were available, and I want to stress that it was just this Australopithecus boisei that was the grass eater. The others, much less grass in their diets. I guess is your question, did this affect their long-term survivability, I guess? Is that the...
Not so much that, but just if their diet was speculated to be largely grass, how did they digest the cellulose? Was it like rabbits where they didn't bother digesting the cellulose, and it was just like intestinal bacteria digested and they ate the bacteria?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And of course, double stomachs don't preserve the geologic record either, but presumably this did not have an herbivore stomach, whatever it was. I don't know. That's a really good question. How did they cope with such a grass-heavy diet?
Regarding this skull that was found on your watch, did you find anything else at that site?
The one that I introduced in the beginning, yeah, the gow's cranium, not much. We didn't find any, there was no postcranial remains from the hominid itself, just the skull. And you notice in the turban there were some other bones there, and they were from probably bovids, things like fossil antelope and stuff like that, but it was not a rich site. Some of these sites, they're full of fossils, non-human. This particular one, no. Yeah.
We have one here. A big difference between sociological evolution and biological evolution
evolution is that the former is Lamarckian, in that you can acquire, you can pass along acquired characteristics. One guy discovers calculus, and the next thing you know, generations all over the world can do calculus, which is quite different than the biological evolution. I haven't seen this emphasized very much.
Yeah.
But I wanted to mention I just wanted to mention that in today's, the Weekender of the Wall Street Journal, there's a large article in the review section, I believe, and it's on a Chinese program to go after the genes for intelligence. And this would probably be a way to go after eugenics. And they may not have the same ethical constraints that you and I would have in this society. You could do quite a bit there without expanding the cranium size.
Let's give Dr. Jay Quade another big round of applause. Everybody stick around. We have another program coming up at 1 o'clock, as you probably know. Lunch is available down here in the cafeteria. Good prices, good food, so hang around. We've got more coming, okay? Thanks for coming.